There are men who survive battles, and there are men who survive battles and spend the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't. August Finkel was the second kind. Dayton, Washington, 1920. A group of men are playing horseshoes behind a general store on a warm afternoon. The conversation turns, as it often did in those years, to the Battle of Little Bighorn. Someone mentions Custer's bravery. Someone else talks about savage Indians. The usual myths, repeated so often they have become furniture in the American mind. And then an old farmer named Frank Finkel, quiet, German, known for his bad dreams and his permanent limp, suddenly shouts loud enough to stop the game. "You don't know what you're talking about." His face goes white. His hands shake. And then he says three words that should have rewritten American history. "I was there 44 years." He had carried those words for 44 years. On June 25, 1876, 210 soldiers rode with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer into the valley of the Little Bighorn River. The official record says every single one of them died. No survivors, no exceptions. But the official record was wrong. One terrified German immigrant named August Finkel stole a dying horse with 42 wounds, rode through thousands of warriors hunting for survivors, and vanished into American history under a fake name. He changed his identity. He married. He raised children. He watched America transform the disaster he escaped into sacred mythology. And for 44 years, he said nothing. By the end of this video, you will understand why his survival was more terrifying than the massacre itself. And you will understand why silence was the only option a living ghost had left. June 1876. America was celebrating its centennial year, 100 years of independence, and the nation was drunk on destiny. Citizens were pushing westward, convinced that God himself had ordained their conquest of the continent. Gold had been discovered in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, land that had been promised to the Lakota Sioux by treaty as long as grass grows and water flows. But treaties meant nothing when yellow metal glittered in stream beds. And so the army was sent to do what armies are always sent to do when promises become inconvenient. Enter George Armstrong Custer. Once the youngest general in Civil War history at the age of 23, the boy general had seen his stars stripped away in peacetime. Now a mere lieutenant colonel, commanding the 7th Cavalry, Custer craved the glory that would restore his name. With his flowing yellow hair and custom-made buckskin jackets, he looked more like a theatrical performer than a cavalry officer. But beneath the showmanship lurked a dangerous combination: tactical brilliance mixed with reckless ambition and a need for fame that overrode every other instinct, including the instinct to keep his men alive. The 7th Cavalry was not an army riding to battle. It was a sacrifice riding to an altar that its commander had built from ambition and dressed up as duty. Custer refused Gatling guns because they would slow the march. He refused additional troops from Colonel Gibbon's column because he feared sharing glory. He carried limited ammunition because pack mules could not keep pace with a rapid advance. Every single decision prioritized speed and reputation over the survival of the men who followed him. But here is the detail that makes the tragedy complete. The Lakota and Northern Cheyenne were not the scattered bands Washington imagined. Under leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, they had assembled the largest gathering of Plains warriors in recorded history. Their camp stretched for 3 miles along the Little Bighorn River. Conservative estimates put 7,000 people in that camp, with up to 2,000 fighting men. And many of those warriors carried repeating rifles, Winchesters and Henrys that could fire 16 shots without reloading, weapons traded from Canadian merchants or taken from dead soldiers in previous fights. The 7th Cavalry carried single-shot Springfield carbines, 1 shot, then reload, against warriors who could fire 16. Among the 7th Cavalry rode Private August Finkel of Company C, a German immigrant, 5 feet 6 inches tall, who had enlisted seeking citizenship and steady pay of $13 a month. He spoke English with a thick accent and wrote his name with the careful penmanship of someone who had learned letters as an adult. He joined the army for opportunity, not glory. He would find neither. What he would find instead was something that no amount of money or citizenship could compensate, a nightmare that would last the rest of his life. On the morning of June 25th, Custer made the decision that killed his command. He divided his force into three. Major Marcus Reno took 3 companies to attack the southern end of the camp. Captain Frederick Benteen took 3 more to sweep west. And Custer kept 5 companies, 210 men, including August Finkel, for what he believed would be the killing blow from the north. Crow scouts who knew this country tried to warn him. Too many Sioux, they said. Too many. Custer looked through his field glasses and saw what he wanted to see. A few dozen lodges, the edge of a camp that actually stretched for 3 miles. He saw opportunity. The scouts saw a grave. The land itself should have been a warning. The Little Bighorn Valley stretches through southern Montana like a green ribbon between barren hills. Grass grows tall enough to hide a mounted warrior, and the terrain rolls in waves, perfect for concealing thousands of lodges until you are almost on top of them. On that morning, temperatures already pushed past 85 degrees. By afternoon, it would reach 100. Men would die as much from heat exhaustion as from bullets. Company C took position on what would later be called Calhoun Hill, a modest elevation named for Custer's brother-in-law who commanded it. From this rise, Finkel could see dust clouds rising from Reno's attack 3 miles to the south. He could hear distant gunfire echoing off the hills, but he could not see what that dust concealed. Reno's command was being routed, men fleeing in panic, warriors swarming from the camp in numbers that no one in the 7th Cavalry had imagined possible. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, the moment arrived that turned a battle into an annihilation. 2 nervous troopers on Company C's left flank saw movement in the valley below. Without orders, without thinking, they raised their Springfields and fired into what they thought was the edge of the village. 2 shots. 2 shots that cracked across the still afternoon air like a death sentence written in gunpowder. Those 2 rounds struck near the Hunkpapa Lakota camp, where women were taking down lodges, preparing to move away from Reno's attack to the south. A child screamed, and 2,000 warriors who had been focused on Reno 3 miles away suddenly knew exactly where Custer was. In the time it takes to pull a trigger twice, 210 death sentences were signed. What rose from the valley next made veteran soldiers freeze where they stood. A sound that started low, like distant thunder rolling across the plains, then built and built, until it became a roar that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath their boots. The war cries of hundreds, then thousands of warriors. They poured from the camp and up the coulées and ravines toward Calhoun Hill like water from a broken dam. And they were not a disorganized mob. Under war chiefs like Crazy Horse and Gall, they moved with tactical precision. While one group pinned soldiers down with long-range fire from repeating rifles, others worked through ravines and gullies, using every fold of terrain. They knew this ground intimately. The soldiers were seeing it for the first time. Company C opened fire. Springfields cracked in volleys. Warriors fell. But for every warrior who dropped, 10 more appeared, and the Springfields were already failing. The carbines jammed when overheated, cartridge cases expanding and sticking in the chambers. Men had to pry them out with hunting knives, while bullets whistled past their ears. For every shot the soldiers managed to fire, 10 came back. This was not a battle. It was systematic destruction by a force with superior numbers, superior weapons, and superior knowledge of every ridge and gully on that hillside. And then the killing began in earnest. Crazy Horse led hundreds of warriors in a sweeping movement around Company C's left flank. They flowed like cavalry themselves, shooting from horseback with accuracy that the soldiers could not match. From the south, Gall's Hunkpapa warriors drove uphill, revenge burning in their hearts for the women and children caught in Reno's attack on their camp. Company C's line bent under the pressure. Then it broke. First Sergeant Edwin Bobo, a Civil War veteran, the kind of man who holds units together when everything else falls apart, tried to rally a handful of soldiers. "Form square," he bellowed. The classic defense against being flanked from multiple directions. But forming a square requires coordination, training, and most importantly, time. They had none of those things. Warriors with repeating rifles simply stood off at range and shot them down one by one. Bobo fell last, still shouting orders that no one could hear over the gunfire, still trying to build a wall out of men who were already falling. The organized resistance that military training had promised lasted less than 20 minutes. After that, there was no training. There was only the animal inside every man, the one that wants to live. Finkel found himself in the middle of disintegration. Beside him, a young Irish private named John Foley was praying in Gaelic between shots, the words tumbling out in a rhythm that had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with a boy calling for God in the language his mother taught him. To their left, Corporal George Lell, a German immigrant like Finkel, worked his carbine with the mechanical blankness of a man whose mind had already left the battlefield even though his body remained. These were not the hardened Indian fighters of dime novel fiction. They were boys and desperate men caught in a nightmare beyond anything their recruitment officers had mentioned. Some soldiers, seeing escape impossible, made a different choice. They drew their revolvers, pressed the barrels to their own temples, and fired. Stories from previous battles had told of what happened to men captured alive on the plains. The suicide shots cracked across the battlefield like periods at the end of life sentences. Each one was a man, deciding that a bullet from his own hand was better than what waited if the warriors reached him first. The sensory overload on that hillside was beyond anything these men had experienced or imagined. Gunpowder smoke so thick that men fired at shadows and muzzle flashes rather than visible targets. The smell of blood mixing with sage and prairie grass, and the alkaline dust that coated everything. Horses screaming. A sound that is nothing like what the movies suggest. A sound that is closer to a human shriek than any animal noise. Men crying for their mothers, in languages from across Europe, German, Irish, Italian. The tongues of immigrants who had crossed an ocean for a promise and found this instead. And underneath it all, the Montana heat, cooking everything into a nightmare that no survivor could ever fully describe, because the words for it do not exist in any language. Then Finkel's horse, a bay mare named Bess, screamed and collapsed beneath him, a warrior's bullet through her chest. Finkel flew over her head and hit the ground face first, prairie grass filling his mouth. His rifle, his lifeline, spun away into the sagebrush. Blood poured from a gash that ran from his hairline to his eyebrow, sheeting down the left side of his face and turning the world red. When he raised his head, he could barely see. Around him, Company C had ceased to exist as a military unit. Men ran in every direction, some toward Custer's position on the hill to the north, others simply away, in any direction that was not toward the warriors flooding up the hillsides. Corporal Lell staggered past him, then fell, 3 arrows in his back. The German immigrant tried to crawl forward, then went still. His Springfield lay just beyond his outstretched hand. Finkel crawled to Lell's body. His hands, slick with blood and sweat, fumbled through the dead man's cartridge pouch. 3 rounds. That was all. 3 cartridges against hundreds of warriors. A Lakota warrior on a painted pony bore down on him, war club raised above his head. Finkel rolled sideways at the last second, the club smashing into the ground where his skull had been. The warrior wheeled for another pass. Finkel grabbed a fist-sized rock, the only weapon within reach, and waited. As the warrior charged again, Finkel threw himself sideways and hurled the rock at the pony's head. The horse shied. Finkel grabbed Lel's rifle, pointed without aiming, and pulled the trigger. The warrior tumbled backward off his mount. The rifle was empty. Lel had fired his last round before dying. Finkel had 3 cartridges, 3 chances to avoid joining the 209 men whose lives were ending on that hillside. Then, through the smoke and chaos, Finkel saw something that changed everything. A horse, a big sorrel gelding named Ginger, standing riderless near the body of Private John James. James lay face down, the back of his head destroyed. But Ginger, despite wounds spotting his hide with blood, still stood. Finkel broke from cover. He ran zigzag through warrior fire, bullets hissing past like hornets. An arrow creased his right calf, tearing through muscle. He stumbled, kept running. 10 yards. 5. He grabbed Ginger's reins. Another bullet punched through his left thigh. The pain was electric, white-hot, the kind that tries to shut the body down. Finkel nearly blacked out, but desperation is a stronger drug than pain. He hauled himself into the saddle. Ginger, a horse that later examination would reveal carried 42 separate wounds, somehow remained standing. Whether from training, or shock, or something that has no name in any language, that animal responded when Finkel kicked his flanks. And then Finkel made the decision that saved his life. He did not ride toward Custer's position, where the remaining soldiers were compressing into a shrinking circle on what would become known as Last Stand Hill. That direction was certain death. Instead, he turned Ginger northwest, directly through the warrior lines. Behind him lay certainty. Ahead lay at least uncertainty, and uncertainty on that afternoon was the closest thing to hope available on that hillside. The ride covered 650 yards, but it felt like 650 miles. Warriors seemed as shocked as Finkel by his desperate charge through their lines. Some fired, mostly missing in their surprise. Others simply watched this lone, bloodied soldier galloping through their ranks on a dying horse. One Cheyenne warrior later told his grandson about seeing a soldier ride past like a ghost, already dead, but not knowing it. Ginger ran on pure heart. There is no other explanation for a horse with 42 wounds still carrying a man through enemy lines. Some deaths between creatures go beyond training or instinct. This was one of them. As 209 men died behind him, Finkel rode into the Badlands. Behind him on Last Stand Hill, the final act played out in minutes. Custer died beside his brother Tom. Captain Keogh fell near his horse Comanche, who would survive with 7 wounds to become the most famous animal in American military history. The entire battle, from first shot to last, took less than 2 hours. 40% of the 7th Cavalry ceased to exist. Ginger collapsed 5 miles from the battlefield, legs simply giving out. Finkel was thrown forward again, hitting the ground on his wounded leg. The pain finally overwhelmed him. He woke to darkness and the sound of wolves. What followed were the longest days of August Finkel's life. He crawled at first, his wounded leg useless, dragging himself through sagebrush and dry creek beds. Every shadow might hide a warrior. Every sound could mean death. By dawn, he had covered perhaps 2 miles. His wounds had stopped bleeding but begun to fester in the heat. He ate grass. He drank his own urine. The Montana sun cooked the landscape, and the man crawling through it with equal indifference. On the 3rd night, certain he was dying, he saw a campfire in the distance. Friend or foe no longer mattered. Death would be a release. He crawled toward the light, croaking through cracked lips. "Help me!" The figure by the campfire spun around, rifle raised. Finkel collapsed, beyond caring whether the next sensation was a bullet or a blessing. Through fever-hazed eyes, he saw a grizzled white man in buckskins approaching cautiously. The stranger spoke. "Jesus Christ, soldier boy. What in hell happened to you?" This was Bill. No last name, no history. Possibly a deserter himself, possibly a trapper, possibly just another drifter in the lawless Montana territory. Whatever his past, Bill saved August Finkel's life. He cleaned the infected wounds with whiskey that burned like liquid fire. The arrow wound in Finkel's calf had begun to turn black. The bullet hole in his thigh had missed the bone but torn muscle badly. "Custer," Finkel managed to whisper. "All dead, Little Bighorn." Bill's reaction told Finkel everything he needed to know about his situation. The man went pale. Then he quickly doused his fire. "If you rode with Custer and lived," Bill said quietly, "you best forget that real quick. Army don't like deserters, and them Indians are hunting survivors." For 3 days, Bill tended Finkel in hidden camps, moving only at night. He packed the wounds with moss and herbs, knowledge he carried from a past he never talked about. Slowly, Finkel's fever broke, but with clarity came a terrible realization. By every military law, Finkel should return to Fort Lincoln and report his survival. But Bill painted the picture that sealed Finkel's decision. "You think they will believe you, sole survivor of Custer's command? They will say you ran before the fighting started. Cowardice in face of the enemy. That means a firing squad." Who was Bill? No last name, no history before or after those 3 days. He appeared from the darkness, saved a dying man's life, and vanished back into it. Some people exist in history only as the reason someone else survived. After a week, Bill brought Finkel to Fort Benton, Montana Territory's wildest town, where steamboats connected to civilization and no one asked questions if you had money for passage. Bill departed as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving Finkel with advice that would shape the next 44 years of his life. Change your name, change your story, become someone else, or die as who you are. In that moment, August Finkel died his second death. The first was on the Army's casualty list. The second was by his own choice. The man who crawled toward Bill's campfire was August Finkel. The man who walked away from it was Frank Finkel. And Frank Finkel would spend 44 years pretending August Finkel had never existed. On June 27th, 2 days after the battle, burial parties from Reno's surviving troops reached the killing field. The smell hit them first, death in 100-degree heat. Then they saw the bodies. 209 white forms scattered across a hillside smaller than a city park, stripped, bloating in the summer sun. Some were mutilated, a practice rooted in spiritual belief, ensuring that enemy spirits could not fight in the afterlife. They compiled casualty lists from company rosters, checking every name against a body. For Company C, they found everyone except one, Private August Finkel. His name went on the killed in action list anyway. One missing body among 210 hardly mattered. They assumed animals had dragged him away. No one imagined that the missing man was alive. On July 6, 1876, Frank Finkel bought a newspaper in Fort Benton. The headline screamed across the front page, "Custer Massacre, Entire Command Killed." Below, in small type, appeared the casualty lists. And there it was, misspelled but unmistakable. Private August Finkel, Company C, 7th Cavalry, killed in action. He was standing in a boarding house in Montana, holding a newspaper that listed his own name among the dead. He was reading his own obituary. His family, if notified, would already be mourning him. The Army believed him dead. The nation believed him dead. And in that moment, standing in a room full of strangers who had no idea they were standing next to a ghost, Finkel understood that the easiest way to survive was to agree with the newspaper. August Finkel was dead. Let him stay dead. In the same paper, a small article confirmed his decision. 2 men had already appeared, claiming to have survived Custer's last stand. The Army had arrested both as deserters from other units, trying to use the confusion to disappear. The message was clear. Anyone claiming to be a survivor was either a liar or a coward. Either way, the answer was a court-martial or a firing squad. Finkel learned to write his new name, Frank Finkel, instead of August. He bought papers belonging to a dead German immigrant. Within weeks, August Finkel ceased to exist, except as one more line on a casualty list that a grieving nation would memorize and mythologize for the next century. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to men who have been declared dead by the world they once belonged to. You walk among the living, but you are a ghost. You eat, you sleep, you breathe. But the person doing all of those things no longer has a name that anyone would recognize. The physical scars healed slowly. The thigh wound left a permanent limp. The calf injury ached before storms for the rest of his life. But the invisible wounds were the ones that never closed. Every night brought the same dreams. Bobo's last stand. Lel dying with arrows in his back. The ride through warrior lines on dying Ginger. The sound of wolves in the darkness. He woke screaming so often that boarding houses asked him to leave. But the nightmares were the least of it. The waking hours were worse, because in the waking hours, he had to pretend to be someone he was not. By August of 1876, Frank Finkel had drifted to Washington Territory. He found work on farms. His German accent and strong back opened doors that his past would have slammed shut. He married. He raised children. He built a life in Dayton, a small town where people minded their own business and did not ask too many questions about a man's history. Neighbors knew him as a quiet, hard-working German immigrant who sometimes woke the household with nightmares he would not explain. When Buffalo Bill's Wild West show came through, glorifying Custer's heroic last stand with actors and blank cartridges and painted Indians, Finkel left the room. When newspapers printed anniversary articles every June 25th, he burned them unread. When people discussed the battle at social gatherings, repeating the myths about brave cavalry and savage hordes, he stayed silent. Every year on June 25th, America celebrated Custer's heroic sacrifice. And every year on June 25th, Frank Finkel locked his door and sat alone with the truth. The myth grew louder with each passing year. The dead became martyrs to manifest destiny. The Lakota and Cheyenne victory was rewritten as a savage interruption of civilized progress. And Custer, the man whose arrogance and ambition had marched 210 men into a grave, became a national hero. Paintings depicted him standing tall on Last Stand Hill, sword drawn, golden hair flowing, fighting to the last like an American Leonidas. The truth was that Custer's body was found with 2 bullet wounds and was one of the few not mutilated, but no sword was drawn, no heroic pose was struck. He died like the rest of them, in dust and noise and confusion, on a hillside that smelled of blood and sage and gunpowder. Finkel knew what the mythmakers did not. There was no glorious last stand. There was chaos. There was terror. There were immigrant boys crying for their mothers in languages from across Europe. There were men putting revolvers to their own heads because the alternative was worse. There was a commanding officer who refused reinforcements because he wanted the glory for himself. And there was one German private who stole a dying horse and rode through enemy lines because behind him was certainty and ahead was at least a chance. Ask yourself honestly, would you have spoken? To speak meant admitting you survived while 209 men died. It meant challenging a national myth that comforted grieving families. It meant being branded either a coward or a liar in a nation that needed its heroes more than it needed the truth. Finkel chose silence. And that silence, year after year after year, let America believe what it needed to believe. 44 years is a long time to carry a secret. It is an even longer time to carry the dead. And then came that afternoon, in 1920, the horseshoe game behind the general store. The casual ignorance of men who had never smelled gunpowder talking about brave Custer and savage Indians, and something inside Frank Finkel, something that had been compressed for 44 years like steam in a boiler, finally broke. I was there. The words came out before he could stop them, and once they were out, they could not be taken back. The revelation split the community. Some believed him immediately. His age was right, his accent matched, and those scars, the thigh wound, the calf wound, the gash across his forehead, had to come from somewhere. Others called him a liar, seeking attention. But Finkel began providing details that only a survivor could know. He described the battlefield's exact layout before detailed maps were widely published. He knew which officers died where, information that matched military records he had never seen. And when investigators compared Frank Finkel's handwriting to Private August Finkel's enlistment papers from 1876, the match was undeniable. The peculiar way he formed his letters, learned in German schools decades earlier, had not changed. 44 years of pretending to be someone else, and the one thing he could not change was the way his hand held a pen. Frank Finkel died on August 31, 1930. He was buried in Dayton, Washington, under the name he had chosen, not the name he was born with. He took secrets to his grave that we will never recover. Who was Bill? How many other survivors might have vanished into frontier anonymity? What happened in those final seconds on Calhoun Hill that made men choose their own revolvers over capture? Sometimes, survival is the cruelest fate. The only white man to escape Custer's last stand spent a lifetime wishing he hadn't. Not because he was a coward, he carried wounds that proved otherwise, but because he learned what America refuses to acknowledge, that our most celebrated military disasters are built on lies. And the truth dies with the survivors who dare not speak it. In Dayton, Washington, in 1920, an old man's hands stopped shaking long enough to say 3 words that should have rewritten American history. I was there. He had carried those words for 44 years. They weighed more than the dead.